Hi, I'm Fraser Douglas, and I've been an avid tent camper for almost 55 years. In this video, I want to try to describe some of the factors that we consider before setting up our camp in a new campsite. Now, defining all of these factors has been a fairly recent project, and we're still trying to figure out the most important factors to consider in each particular campsite that we visit. And so you will see some photos of old campsites where we don't follow all of the principles or guidelines that we're trying to follow now. And I'll just use these photos to try to describe how we would set it up now if we went back to that same campsite. Hope you enjoy this video.
If you just have a small tent and you only plan to spend one night in the campsite, you can set the tent up anywhere you want to without much thought. But if you want to set up a relatively large family camping sleeping tent and a relatively large kitchen tent, you'll need to sit down and carefully examine the campsite features to determine the best places to set up each tent and the best way to orient their front doors. So let me describe the basic principles that we follow when deciding where to position our tent and our kitchen shelter and how to orient their front doors. The first, and perhaps the most important factor to consider, is how the water will drain through this campsite if it should rain during your camping trip. To do this, you'll need to sit down for a few minutes and study the topography of your campsite. Look for high spots and low spots. You want to set your tent and your kitchen shelter up on the high spots and avoid the low spots that might collect water after a heavy rain. If your campsite has an elevated tent pad, then that's where you need to set up your tent, and all you have to do is decide how to orient your front door. If your campsite does not have an elevated tent pad, then a slight incline is better for water drainage than a completely level campsite. Just be sure that your tent and kitchen shelter are near the top of the incline rather than at the bottom. Plus, the incline allows you to sleep with your head slightly elevated. The second factor that we consider is we want to set our kitchen shelter up so that it is near the back of our car when our car is parked in the campsite. The reason for setting it up near our car is because we keep all of our food in the car at all times except when we are cooking or eating, so that we can avoid animal scavenger problems. When we're cooking a meal, we're constantly having to grab milk or butter or eggs or cheese or something else out of the back of the car, and we don't want to have to walk a long distance between our cooking area and our food storage area. Since our kitchen shelter is usually set up near our car in the front of the campsite, we usually set up our tent toward the back of the campsite. In this position, we are further away from the road and the noise of cars and people passing by. And we have a little more privacy so that we can change clothes without offending our camp neighbors. We try to set up both our sleeping tent and our kitchen shelter at least 15 feet away from a fire ring at all times, but this is especially important in cool weather when we may want to have a nice campfire. We don't want embers from the campfire drifting over and burning a hole in our sleeping tent or our kitchen shelter. And we don't want to trip over the fire ring when we're walking near our tent. Pedestal grills are sometimes available in the campsite, especially in Army Corps of Engineers campgrounds and U.S. Forest Service campgrounds. And if we have one in our campsite, we try to set up our kitchen shelter so that it is kind of close to the pedestal grill, and we try to use the pedestal grill to cook a few meals over a wood fire. Since we don't have a generator or solar charger, we try to secure a campsite with electric service as often as possible so that we can recharge our iPhones, our iPads, our camp lights, and other items that have rechargeable batteries. We pack two 15-foot extension cords and one 25-foot extension cord in our camp kit and try to set up both our sleeping tent and our kitchen shelter so that they are close enough to each have power. But if we can't get power to both of those tents, we prefer to have our kitchen shelter close to the power service in hot weather to run a fan, and we prefer to have our sleeping tent near the power in cool weather to run our heater. Ideally, your campsite will have a few trees that can help to cool your site during hot summer days and block the bright sunlight that would make it difficult to read and relax in your campsite. But if you're expecting hot summer weather and your campsite only has one or two trees, then you may want to set your sleeping tent up right where the shade of the tree falls in the afternoon to try to block some of that heat. Most developed campgrounds now have water spigots in each campsite, and these spigots are located near the electrical service for the convenience of people that are in RVs. But a few campgrounds, especially U.S. Forest Service campgrounds, still have one centrally located water spigot or well that is designed to serve several campsites. When setting up our campsite, it would be nice to have our kitchen shelter located fairly near the water spigot, but that's not important. The most important thing is not to block access to the spigot. Typically, we fill 2 or 3 gallon jugs about twice a day. And we use this water for cooking, for washing dishes, and for washing our hands and face. Developed campgrounds typically have a picnic table located in every campsite, and hopefully this picnic table is going to be light enough to move anywhere you want to move it in the campsite, because frequently it may be sitting in a spot that would be an ideal spot to put either your sleeping tent or your kitchen shelter. Unfortunately, a few campgrounds still have concrete tables or very heavy tables or tables that are bolted to the ground that make it very difficult to set your campsite up according to some of the other principles. Most of the time, we orient the front doors of our tent and kitchen shelter so that they face the central area and primary pathway through the campsite. But on a few occasions, we may orient the door in a different direction. For example, on a cool, windy day, we may not want our door facing the north. And on hot, sunny afternoons, we may not want our door facing to the west. In small campsites, we must consider guideline placement when deciding how to orient the front doors of our tent and kitchen. We always deploy guidelines to the sides of our sleeping tent and kitchen shelter, and we don't want these guidelines blocking logical traffic pathways where they could trip someone.
Well, that's a pretty good summary of the factors that we consider. Now let's look at some various different types of campsites and see how we apply these factors.
The best campsites, in my opinion, are extra large, relatively level campsites with grass or dirt surface. And you can still find a few of these sites around the country. In these sites, you can set up your sleeping tent and your kitchen shelter just anywhere you want to, as long as you avoid low spots where water might collect after heavy rain. For many years, my dream has been to set up a base camp in one of these extra large campsites for a month or two during the summer. U.S. Forest Service campsites frequently have a long asphalt parking pad for RVs, but in addition they have a lot of extra level ground space where you can set up your tent and your kitchen canopy almost any place you want. Many of these campsites have a tent pad at the end of the paved parking pad, and that's where the sleeping tent should be set up. So in this campsite, we should have set up our tent at the end of the asphalt pad and our kitchen shelter closer to the car. So our campsite setup would look similar to this one. Here in the southeastern United States, many state parks offer large gravel pads where you can set up both your sleeping tent and your kitchen shelter. And most of the time, this gravel base is level and drains very well, so you don't have to worry about water buildup after heavy rain. This campsite also has an elevated tent pad. A few national forest campgrounds also offer these large gravel pads. This photo was taken several years ago, but if we return to this campsite, we would set our tents up on the back edge of the site and move the table and our kitchen shelter up closer to our car and the entrance of the campsite. Many campgrounds here in the southeastern United States offer gravel pads that are shaped like a flag with a long, narrow parking area for RVs and a smaller auxiliary area where your picnic table and fire ring may be located. Sometimes we can set up our sleeping tent in the auxiliary area, but frequently this auxiliary area is too crowded with a picnic table, lantern pole, fire ring, and perhaps a pedestal grill. And so usually we set up our sleeping tent and our kitchen shelter on the long, narrow part where the RV would usually park. But in this setup, you should be aware that a round kitchen shelter, such as a clam or a gazelle, will occupy a large amount of that narrow parking area, while a rectangular-shaped kitchen shelter, such as this Eureka No Bug Zone, would fit much better on that narrow parking pad. Without a doubt, the most difficult place to set up a kitchen shelter and a sleeping tent is in a small campsite. In this small crowded site, we should have put our tents where our kitchen shelter is and moved our kitchen shelter onto the asphalt pad. In these two campsites, the only place to set the tent up was on the asphalt pad because all of the ground around the pad was like a bowl that held water after rainfall. Private campgrounds frequently have small campsites. In this case, we would have been better off if we had our rectangular kitchen canopy rather than this large round one. But regardless of the kitchen shelter that we had to be sure to set them up so that guy lines did not block this very narrow walkway. And this campsite is probably the worst one we've ever had. Not only is it small, but it's also sloped. And we received considerable rainfall that puddled right at the front door of our tent. In retrospect, we should have set that tent up near the car at the top of the slope.
Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope that you've learned something that will help you set up your campsite in a more comfortable way the next time you go camping.
For more information about campsite setup and other tent camping procedures, please visit my website, moderntentcamping.com. A link is provided in the description below. And also visit my Facebook page titled Modern Tent Camping.
Thanks for watching.